"He is the one promised to us," said the giant women found inside the barn. Billy Thompson never imagined that buying an abandoned farm in the middle of the Arizona desert could change his life in such a strange way. He had worked for 15 years in the copper mines to save enough money, and when he finally succeeded, he chose this isolated property for a simple reason. He wanted peace. The previous owner, a man named Jeremiah Crow, had sold everything in a suspicious hurry, taken his things, and disappeared on a Tuesday morning, leaving only dust in the air and a few confusing words about responsibilities that pass from father to son. The farm was 2 days' ride from the nearest town, surrounded by rocky mountains that looked like broken teeth against the ever-blue sky. Billy enjoyed solitude. After years of breathing stale air deep in the earth, that dry, clean wind was like a blessing. The main house was in good condition, with thick adobe walls that kept the interior cool during the day and warm during the cold desert nights. During the first few weeks, Billy focused his efforts on repairing the fences and cleaning the corrals. The work was heavy, but familiar. His calloused hands knew well the weight of tools and the strength of sun-dried wood. He noticed that the property had a strange structure. In addition to the main house and the stables, there was a huge barn, much larger than would be needed for a farm of that size. The doors were tall and wide, made of thick wood reinforced with iron bars. It was in the third week that he began to hear the sounds. It began as a low murmur that came from the barn during the nights. Billy first thought they were rats or bats, but the sounds had a strange rhythm, almost like whispered conversations. As he approached the large wooden doors, silence immediately set in, as if something on the other side was waiting, listening to his footsteps on the beaten earth. During the day, curiosity grew like thirst in the desert. Billy walked around the barn, noting the tall windows covered with planks nailed inside. He tried to peer through the cracks, but the darkness inside was complete. The hinges of the main doors were rusty, but not so much that they could not be opened with a little force. There was also a new padlock, the keys to which Jeremiah Crow had left on a nail next to the kitchen door, along with a note that said only, "When the time comes, you'll know." In the fourth week, the sounds changed. What were once low murmurs turned into something that looked like crying. Billy woke up one morning to the sound of sobs coming from the barn. They were deep, loaded with a sadness that made his chest tighten. He put on his boots and walked through the dark night to the great doors. The sobs stopped the moment his feet touched the wood of the entrance. That night, Billy was unable to go back to sleep. He sat on the porch, staring out at the barn under the starlight, trying to understand what Jeremiah Crow had left behind. The old farmer had no known family in the region, but there were strange rumors about him. Some said he was a widower, others that he never married. There were also stories about strange lights seen on the farm during new moon nights, but Billy had always considered this kind of talk to be small-town superstition. The next morning, he made a decision. Billy took the keys from the nail next to the kitchen when the sun was high enough to drive away any shadow of cowardice that might have remained from the night before. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped the cold metal, but he attributed it to the strong coffee he had drunk for breakfast. The walk to the barn seemed longer than ever, each step kicking up a small cloud of red dust that clung to his leather boots. The hinges protested with a long groan as Billy turned the key and pushed one of the large doors open. The darkness that revealed itself was as thick as standing water, and a strange smell escaped through the opening. It was not rot or mold, but something sweet and heavy, like withered flowers mixed with spices he could not identify. Billy hesitated at the entrance, letting his eyes get used to the dim light before taking the first step inside. What he saw made him instinctively retreat. In the center of the barn were 5 huge figures sitting in a circle on the dirt floor. They were women. This he could see by the soft curves of their bodies and the long hair that fell like curtains around their lowered faces. But they were too big. Each one had to be at least 10 feet tall, even when seated. They wore simple dresses of thick fabric, the kind that frontier women used to make, but in their gigantic proportions, the clothes looked like colorful tents. They didn't move when Billy walked in, but he knew they were aware of their presence. I could feel the weight of their gazes, even with their faces down. The silence in the barn was absolute, as if the very air was holding its breath. Billy took 2 more cautious steps inward, his right hand instinctively resting on the handle of the revolver on his hip. It was then that the closest raised her head. His eyes were so light blue that they seemed almost white, and there was a sadness in them that was old and deep like artesian wells. Her face had delicate features despite its size, with a melancholic beauty that resembled paintings of saints in old churches. When she spoke, her voice was surprisingly soft, like wind passing through dry leaves. "He is the one we were promised," she said, and the other 4 raised their heads in unison, revealing equally beautiful and sad faces. Billy felt his knees weaken, not out of fear, though there was fear, but out of a strange sense of recognition, as if I were seeing something I had dreamed long ago and forgotten when I woke up. The giant woman's voice echoed in his memory, awakening memories he didn't know he had. "Who are you?" she managed to ask, her own voice ringing small in the barn's wide space. The one who had spoken first bowed her head slightly, a gesture that in its size seemed formal and royal. "We are the daughters of Jeremiah Crow," she said, "and now we are your responsibilities, Billy Thompson." The fact that she knew his name didn't surprise him as much as it should have. Nothing else at that moment seemed to follow the normal rules of the world he knew. Billy looked at each of the 5 giant women. They were all of seemingly different ages. The youngest appeared to be in her 20s, while the oldest showed grey strands in her brown hair. They all carried the same expression of patient sadness. "Why are you here?" Billy asked. "Why did Jeremiah leave them?" "Because the time has come for him to leave," replied another of the women, this one with golden hair that shone even in the dim light of the barn. "And your time has come to take care of us." Billy felt a strange weight settle on his shoulders, as if an invisible, heavy blanket had been placed over him. There was something about those women that touched an ancient part of their soul, a part that recognized obligations that came before the law of men, before contracts signed and deeds recorded. "I don't understand," he said, but even saying that, a part of him was already beginning to understand. The first woman held out a giant hand toward him, her palm turned upwards in a gesture that was both pleading and offering. "Jeremiah found us when we were little," she said. "He created us, protected us, kept us safe from the world that doesn't understand us. Now he's gone, and we need someone who can do the same." Billy looked at the outstretched hand. It was bigger than his head, but there was a delicacy about it that made him think of wounded birds. "What if I can't?" he asked. "What if I don't know how?" "You'll know," the woman said, and there was a certainty in her voice that was stronger than any doubt Billy could have. "For you are the one promised to us." Billy spent 3 days avoiding the barn after that first meeting. He tried to convince himself that he had imagined it all, the heat of the desert, the loneliness, perhaps some poisonous plant he had touched without realizing it. But every morning, he woke up with the certainty that 5 giant women were waiting for him on the other side of those thick wooden doors. And every night, he heard their low murmurs wafting through the farm like whispered prayers. On the 4th day, he found food disappearing from his pantry. They were not small quantities, whole sacks of flour, cans of beans, large pieces of jerky he had bought on his last trip to the city. Billy first thought of burglars, but there were no strange footprints around the house, no signs of a break-in. The food simply disappeared during the night, as if the air itself had carried it away. That's when he understood that they needed to eat. The realization came like a punch in the stomach. Of course they needed to eat. They were living beings, as strange as they were, and living beings need sustenance. Jeremiah Crow must have spent a fortune feeding 5 women that size. Billy did quick math on his head and felt a cold sweat run down his back. His money saved from the mines would not last 2 months with that consumption. That afternoon, he carried 2 sacks of flour and a large can of molasses to the barn. He knocked on the doors before entering in a gesture of courtesy that seemed important to him. The 5 women were sitting in exactly the same position as 3 days ago, as if they hadn't moved an inch since. The golden-haired woman smiled when she saw the food, and it was like seeing the sun rising over the mountains. His gratitude seemed sincere and profound, expressed through a respectful nod of the head that carried decades of careful upbringing. Billy realized that they hadn't eaten a lovingly prepared meal in a long time. He looked around the barn and for the first time noticed details he had missed in his initial shock. In one corner was an area where the floor was cleaner, with dark circles that looked like the marks of large pots. Near the wall were piles of firewood and some custom-made kitchen utensils, paddle-sized spoons, knives as large as short swords. The oldest of the 5, the one with grey strands, gestured softly to indicate her sisters. Billy observed that there was a natural hierarchy between them. The golden-haired one seemed to be Martha, the second in command. A green-eyed brunette who seemed to see through people was clearly Sarah. Rebecca, the second youngest, had an air of premature responsibility, and Elizabeth, the youngest, maintained a posture that still retained traces of youth despite her early 20s. Through careful gestures and facial expressions, they were able to communicate their story to Billy. They had been born that size, daughters of a mother Jeremiah described as special, coming from a place where people were different. Their mother died when Elizabeth was born, and Jeremiah had promised to keep them safe from the outside world. Billy sat on a pile of hay trying to collect his thoughts. 5 giant orphaned women, raised in secret on a secluded desert farm. A foster father who protected them for decades and then disappeared, leaving them in the care of a stranger. It didn't make sense at all, but at the same time, it made all the sense in the world. The expression on their faces revealed that they knew exactly why Jeremiah had chosen him. His eyes spoke of careful observation, of a man who had been studied and approved before he even knew he was being tested. Jeremiah had seen something in him during their few conversations, perhaps the honesty with which he had talked about his 15 years in the mines, or the dignity with which he had explained why he had never married, preferring not to bring a wife into a life of poverty. The 5 sisters watched him with a mixture of hope and fear. They could be big, but Billy was beginning to understand that the world outside was even bigger and much more cruel. They knew they could not protect themselves from human cruelty, from morbid curiosity, from those who would see them as monstrosities or circus attractions. Martha pointed delicately to the food he had brought, then gestured that indicated brevity. A few days, maybe less. His provisions were running low, and Billy was the only person in the world who knew of his existence. The responsibility weighed on his shoulders like a blanket of lead. Billy realized that he had reached the moment of decision. He could just leave, sell the farm to someone else, and go back to his life in the mines. But when he looked at those 10 eyes turned to him, 5 pairs of hope mixed with fear, he knew that this option had never really existed. Jeremiah Crow had chosen well. Billy Thompson was exactly the kind of man who was unable to abandon those who needed him, even if it meant sacrificing the peace he had sought for so many years. The decision came one night when Billy woke up to the sound of rain hitting the roof. It was the first rain since he had arrived at the farm, and the sound of water against the parched wood seemed like a blessing from heaven. He got up and walked to the window, watching the thick droplets turn the red dust into dark mud. In the barn, a wisp of yellowish light escaped from under the large doors. The sisters had lit a lamp and were awake, probably worried about whether the old structure would withstand the storm. Billy put on his boots and hat, grabbed a lamp of his own, and walked through the rain to the barn. When he opened the doors, he found the 5 women gathered at one end, where some leaks dripped through loose tiles. They had placed buckets and pans to trim the water, but still a considerable area of the floor was wet. It was at that moment, seeing them vulnerable and wet like giant birds taking refuge from the storm, that Billy knew with absolute certainty that he could not abandon them. In the days that followed, he began to make practical changes. First, he repaired the roof of the barn, climbing the tall structure with nails between his teeth and hammer in hand, working under the scorching desert sun that had returned after the rain. The sisters watched him from below, and Billy could feel the gratitude in their eyes every time a leak stopped dripping. Then came the issue of food. Billy made careful calculations and realized that he would need at least 3 times as many supplies as he had originally planned. This meant more frequent trips to the city, which would eventually raise suspicions. He decided to start shopping in different cities, spreading his purchases so as not to attract the attention of curious merchants. The first trip to get supplies was a strange experience. Billy rode for 2 days to the nearest town, but all the way he felt as if he were abandoning something precious and fragile. When he arrived at the general store, he had to control himself not to buy excessive quantities at once. He bought what he could carry without looking suspicious, and promised the merchant that he would be back soon. On the way back, Billy thought about how his life had changed. 3 weeks ago, he was a free man, master only of his own problems and responsibilities. Now she carried the weight of 5 lives on her shoulders, 5 women who depended completely on her discretion and care to continue existing in the world. When she arrived at the farm, the sisters were waiting at the entrance of the barn. The anxiety on their faces was palpable. Billy realized that they had feared that he would just not come back, that he would abandon them, as so many other people probably would have done. The silent joy they showed when they saw him return touched something deep in her chest. A routine was established. Billy would wake up before dawn, run errands on the farm until mid-morning, then go to the barn to bring food and check if the sisters needed anything. He found that they were surprisingly self-sufficient. They knew how to cook, sew, and even make small repairs to their belongings. Jeremiah had taught his adopted daughters well. During the weeks that followed, Billy began to understand the individual personalities of each of the sisters. The eldest was clearly the natural leader, making practical decisions and organizing the others. Martha, the golden-haired one, had a gentle temperament and often mediated minor conflicts between the sisters. Sarah, the green-eyed brunette, was observant and intelligent, always seeming to understand situations before others. Rebecca showed practical creativity, always finding better ways to do things. And Elizabeth, the youngest, still maintained a youthful curiosity about the outside world, asking silent questions through gestures and expressions. It was Elizabeth who first showed interest in what Billy was doing outside the barn. During a particularly hot afternoon, he was repairing a nearby fence when he noticed a pair of huge eyes peering through a crack in the wooden walls. When he looked straight ahead, the eyes quickly disappeared, but Billy had seen the curiosity in them. The situation created a dilemma in his mind. The sisters had spent their entire lives confined to the barn, protected but also prisoners of their own difference. Billy began to wonder if this was really a life or just an elaborate form of survival. One night, as he sat on the porch watching the stars, he heard different sounds coming from the barn. They were not the usual murmurs or the noises of everyday life. It was music, female voices, harmonizing in a low, melancholy melody. Billy had never heard anything so beautiful and sad at the same time. The voices intertwined like silk threads, creating a song that seemed to speak of longing for a world they could never know. At that moment, Billy understood that his responsibility went beyond simply keeping them alive and fed. He would need to find a way to give them some form of happiness, some connection to the world that had rejected them before he had even met them. The real proof of his decision, however, was yet to come. The test came on an autumn afternoon when 3 men showed up at the farm riding horses, sweaty from the long ride. Billy saw them coming when they were still just dots in the distance, kicking up dust against the orange evening sky. He recognized one of them. It was the sheriff of the town where he had bought supplies the week before. The men dismounted near the main house, their eyes scouring the property with the suspicious curiosity of someone who had come to investigate rumors. Billy walked to meet them with a firm step, but his heart beat like a drum of war. In the barn, she knew that 5 pairs of giant eyes were watching through the cracks, waiting to see if they would be betrayed or protected. The sheriff was a thin man with a grey moustache and eyes that had seen much of the dark side of humanity. He introduced his companions, a local merchant and a stranger, who identified himself only as someone interested in unusual phenomena. Billy greeted everyone with the necessary courtesy, but kept his arms relaxed close to his body, ready for any eventuality. The questions started subtle. How long he lived there, if he was satisfied with the purchase, if he had found anything strange left by the former owner. Billy replied with the truth he could tell, omitting only what mattered. Yes, there were some old belongings. No, nothing of particular value. Yes, I was satisfied with the solitude of the place. It was when the merchant mentioned the excessive food purchases that Billy knew the danger was real. Someone had noticed the pattern, added up the numbers, and came to conclusions. The stranger talked about local legends, whispered stories about the Crow family, and things that shouldn't exist. Billy felt the weight of the revolver on his hip, but he knew that violence would be the last option. These were curious men, not bandits. They could still be convinced, distracted, sent away with reasonable explanations. He invited them into the house, offered them coffee, and began to weave a careful story about his loneliness, about how life in the mines had affected his eating habits, about the large stocks he kept as a precaution against isolation. The men listened, but Billy saw doubt growing in his eyes like shadows in the evening. It was then that he heard the sound, a low moan coming from the barn, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable to those who knew what to hear. The 3 visitors turned in the direction of the sound, and Billy saw his suspicions turn to certainty. The moment of truth had arrived. Billy made his final decision in that instant. He got up from the table, walked to the window, and looked in the direction of the barn. Then he turned to the 3 men, and in the firm voice of someone who had nothing left to hide, told them that yes, there was something in the barn. Something that Jeremiah Crow had protected, and that was now under his protection. The men followed Billy through the golden afternoon to the barn doors. He turned the key with steady hands, pushed the big doors open, and revealed what was inside. The 3 visitors were in absolute silence, their faces showing a mixture of astonishment, fear, and something close to respect. The 5 sisters were sitting in their usual circle, but this time they did not bow their heads. They looked directly at strangers with quiet dignity, allowing them to be seen for what they really were. Not monsters or curiosities, but women who had long since learned to accept their difference with grace. The sheriff was the first to regain his voice. He asked some practical questions about security, about resources, about Billy's intentions. The merchant remained silent, clearly out of his zone of knowledge. The stranger watched the sisters with bright eyes of scientific fascination. Billy answered all questions with straightforward honesty. Yes, he planned to take care of them for as long as it took. Yes, he understood the responsibility he had assumed. No, they posed no danger to anyone. No, I didn't want outside attention or curious visitors. When the 3 men finally left, it was with tacit agreement. The sheriff promised discretion in exchange for the assurance that Billy would keep the situation under control. The trader agreed not to spread rumors. The stranger walked away with the expression of someone who had seen something that would forever change his understanding of the world. That night, Billy sat in the barn with the 5 sisters for the first time since he had met them. They didn't speak. They never did, but there was a new quality to the silence between them. It was the stillness of trust established, of promise kept, of protection offered and accepted. Billy Thompson had found his purpose in that barren place among the mountains. It wasn't the peace they had originally sought, but it was something better. It was the certainty that their life had meaning, that their choices mattered, that they had become the very one they were promised. Under the desert stars, 5 giant women and an ordinary man lived out their silent truth, protected by the vastness of the world that had forgotten them. If this story of courage and survival has touched your heart, you can't miss our upcoming adventures in the American Wild West. Subscribe to the channel to follow more narratives about men and women who braved the unforgiving wilderness in search of redemption, and leave your comment below telling us what was the most emotional moment of this story for you. Was it when Billy first opened the barn doors and discovered the 5 giant sisters? Or perhaps when he made the final decision to protect them, even at the risk of his own safety in front of suspicious visitors?